8:17 p.m., the 48th floor of a premier financial tower in Boston. Most staff had already headed home. A 36-year-old female CEO stepped into the elevator, clutching a thick folder. The doors were about to slide shut. Suddenly, two men rushed inside. The metal wings closed. Silence. The elevator began its long descent. A few floors passed in heavy, ringing tension. Then one man took a deliberate step closer. "Long day, Ms. Carter?" In the far corner, a 40-year-old single dad stood quietly with his maintenance toolbox. He looked up, and when he spoke, everything changed. Elias Thorne was 40 years old, and for the last 5 years he had been walking through life with a missing piece of his soul. His wife had passed away when their daughter Maya was only 4, leaving him to navigate the world of pigtails, math homework, and scraped knees all on his own. Elias wasn't a man of many words. He was a man of action, a man of steady hands and a quiet heart. He worked as a lead maintenance technician for the massive skyscraper in Boston, a job that most people in expensive suits didn't even notice. He deliberately chose the evening shift, starting when the sun began to dip behind the Atlantic and finishing long after the city lights had flickered into a dull hum. His uniform, though clean, bore the faint scent of machine oil and hydraulic fluid, a stark contrast to the expensive colognes that usually occupied the executive suites. Elias didn't mind the invisibility of his role. In fact, he found a certain dignity in the hum of the ventilation and the steady rhythm of the elevators. Every bolt he tightened and every circuit he checked was a silent contribution to the safety of thousands. But his true motivation lay outside these glass walls. He worked for the small voice on the other end of the phone, for the future he promised to protect. The calloused skin on his palms told the story of a man who built comfort for others while carrying his own burdens in the quiet hours of the night. The reason for this grueling schedule was simple. It allowed him to be there for Maya during the day. He was the one who made her pancakes in the shape of stars. He was the one who walked her to the bus stop and stayed until the yellow vehicle disappeared around the corner. He was the one who sat in the front row of every school play, even if he was the only dad there with grease under his fingernails. His life was a delicate balance of heavy machinery and bedtime stories. On this particular evening, just before his shift truly intensified, he pulled out his phone for a brief moment of connection. He called home, and his face softened immediately as a small, energetic voice filled his ear. "Did you finish your math, Maya?" Elias asked, leaning against the cold wall of the maintenance room. He could hear her breathing on the other end, the sound of a pencil scratching against paper. "Yes, Daddy," she replied, her voice filled with pride. "I did the long division and the word problems too. Come home soon, okay? I saved you a drawing." Elias smiled, a genuine, tired smile that reached his eyes. "I'll be there before you wake up, sweetheart. I promise." Meanwhile, 40 floors above him, Sarah Carter was closing the lid of her laptop. At 36, she was the CEO of one of the most successful investment firms in the city. She was brilliant, sharp, and had a reputation for being unbreakable. But tonight she felt the weight of the world. She had just finalized a massive multi-million-dollar merger that had taken months of sleepless nights and high-stakes negotiations. Her office was empty, the quiet of the executive suite a stark contrast to the chaos of the trading floor during the day. As she gathered her leather briefcase and stepped toward the elevator, she wasn't thinking about power or profit. She was thinking about the silence of her own apartment and the exhaustion in her bones. She pressed the button for the lobby, the light reflecting off her polished watch. She was a woman who was used to being in control, used to making the decisions that moved the markets. She didn't know that in a few minutes, that control would be stripped away in a confined space of glass and steel. The elevator doors opened on the 48th floor. Sarah stepped in, feeling the slight vibration of the cables as they prepared to lower her to the ground. Just as the doors were closing, two men in sharp, dark suits moved quickly, sliding through the gap with practiced ease. They didn't look like the usual late-night office workers. Their suits were expensive, but their energy was jagged, aggressive. They stood between Sarah and the door, their backs to the control panel. For the first few floors, the only sound was the muffled whirring of the elevator's motor. Sarah looked at the floor indicator, watching the numbers tick down. 45, 44, 43. The tension started as a faint prickle on the back of her neck. One of the men, the taller one with a jagged scar near his temple, turned slightly toward her. "You've been avoiding our calls, Miss Carter," he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let her face betray her. She had faced corporate raiders and aggressive boards. She knew how to hold her ground. "I don't take business calls after hours, and I certainly don't take them in elevators," she replied, her voice cool and professional. "Contact my office tomorrow morning. My assistant will find a time if your proposal has any merit." The second man chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "We aren't interested in your assistant, Sarah, and we aren't interested in your schedule. We're interested in the signature you didn't put on that contract today." He took a step closer, encroaching on her personal space. The air in the elevator suddenly felt very thin. They weren't just shareholders. They were representatives of a shadow consortium that Sarah had spent months trying to keep at bay. Their presence here, in the sanctuary of her own building, meant the perimeter had been breached. The taller man, whom she recognized as Miller, leaned in. "That merger is a two-way street, Sarah. You take the glory, we take our cut. If you think you can freeze us out, you've got another thing coming." The predatory glint in his eyes made it clear that this wasn't about business anymore. It was about domination. The polished brass and wood paneling of the elevator, usually a symbol of luxury, now felt like a gilded cage. Suddenly, the elevator shuddered. It didn't just stop. It jolted violently, the lights flickering for a terrifying second before the emergency red glow took over. They were stuck between floors. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Sarah's own quickened breathing. The two men exchanged a look. This wasn't part of their plan, but they were quick to adapt. They moved closer, flanking her. The space was now dangerously small. Sarah felt the cold metal of the back wall against her shoulders. She looked for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. These men weren't here for a conversation. They were here for intimidation. They thought they had her alone. They thought the darkness and the isolation of the stuck elevator would break her resolve. In the corner, obscured by the shadow of his toolbox and the dim emergency light, Elias Thorne stood perfectly still. He had been watching them from the moment they stepped in. As a maintenance man, he knew every vibration of this building. He knew why the elevator had stopped, a simple sensor trip that he could fix in his sleep. But he also knew something much more important. He knew the look on a woman's face when she was being hunted. He saw the way Sarah's knuckles were white as she gripped her briefcase. He saw the predatory stance of the men in suits. He didn't react immediately. He wasn't a man who rushed into things. He was a man who assessed the structural integrity of a situation before he applied pressure. He waited. He watched. He listened to the way the men spoke, the way they tried to use their physical presence to crush her spirit. He thought of Maya and the world he wanted her to grow up in, a world where she wouldn't have to be afraid in a room full of men. The taller man reached out, his hand slamming against the elevator's control panel, specifically over the door open and emergency call buttons. He was physically blocking any attempt she might make to signal for help. "You're going to listen to us now, Sarah," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "This merger doesn't happen without our piece of the pie. You think you're so smart, sitting up there in your glass tower, but down here things are different." The flickering red light cast long, demonic shadows across the interior. Miller's face was twisted in a smirk of perceived victory. To him, Sarah was no longer the powerful CEO. She was just a woman trapped in a box. He reached out to grab her arm, his fingers tightening like a vice. "Sign the digital release on your phone, Sarah. Now, before this elevator accidentally drops another 20 floors." The threat hung in the air, cold and lethal. The mechanical groans of the building's settling weight added a haunting soundtrack to the extortion. Sarah felt a surge of genuine fear. Her mind raced through options. Could she scream? Who would hear her through the soundproof shafts? Could she fight? They were two, and they were much larger. She tried to maintain her CEO persona, but her voice trembled slightly. "You are making a very large mistake. This building has security. My team knows exactly where I am. Your team is at home, Sarah. And security? They're busy watching the front desk and drinking coffee. They don't care about a little glitch in elevator 4, the second man said, reaching for the folder in her hand. That was when Elias Thorne decided it was time to speak. He didn't yell. He didn't move aggressively. He simply cleared his throat, a sound that cut through the menacing atmosphere like a blade. The two men spun around, having completely forgotten or dismissed the man in the corner with the toolbox. The security cameras in this elevator record audio too, Elias said. His voice was steady, deep, and carried a weight of absolute certainty. It wasn't the voice of a servant. It was the voice of the man who owned the machinery they were currently trapped in. The two men froze. The tall one narrowed his eyes, trying to see Elias clearly in the red light. "Shut up, old man. This doesn't concern you." Elias didn't flinch. He took one step forward, stepping out of the shadows. The red light caught the rugged lines of his face and the calm intensity in his eyes. "Actually, it does. I'm the one who maintains these cameras, and I'm the one who knows that because of the jolt we just felt, the emergency protocol has already been triggered. The control room isn't just watching, they're listening to every word you're saying. They've already identified both of you from the high-res feed on the 48th floor." He lied with the precision of a master craftsman. He knew the cameras were older models that struggled in low light, and he knew the audio was often garbled. But he said it with such quiet authority that the men hesitated. The power dynamic in the small room shifted instantly. Elias was no longer a bystander. He was the arbiter of their fate. "You're full of it," the second man snarled, though his hand dropped from Sarah's folder. Elias looked him dead in the eye. "Am I? Check the corner above the panel. See that small blue blinking light? That means the direct feed is live. It means the police are being dispatched to the lobby right now. You have about 3 minutes before those doors open, and you're met with a dozen officers who have a recording of you threatening a federal witness." He spoke about it as if he were explaining a broken pipe. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple, unavoidable fact of life. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just stating the truth of the environment. The men looked at the camera. They looked at each other. The bravado that had filled the elevator moments ago began to leak out like air from a punctured tire. They weren't professional criminals. They were corporate thugs who relied on the silence and fear of their victims. Faced with the certainty of being caught, their resolve crumbled. "We were just talking," the tall one muttered, stepping away from Sarah and moving toward the other side of the elevator. "Sounded like a lot more than talking to me," Elias said, his voice remaining calm. "And I'm sure the DA will agree." Suddenly, the elevator hummed back to life. The red light vanished, replaced by the bright, sterile white of the standard overheads. The elevator began to move again. 12, 11, 10. The silence was different now. It was the silence of the defeated. Sarah stood straight, her breath hitching as she adjusted her coat. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and profound gratitude. When the doors finally slid open at the lobby, the two men didn't look back. They practically ran across the marble floor, disappearing into the night before the security guards could even look up from their monitors. The elevator was quiet once more. Sarah stood there for a moment, her hand pressed against her chest, feeling her heart slowly return to its normal rhythm. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her shaky and drained. She turned to the man in the corner. He was already leaning down, picking up his toolbox as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt small compared to what he had just done. "Truly, I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Elias shrugged, a simple movement of his broad shoulders. He stood up and pushed a strand of dark hair back from his forehead. "Just stating the obvious, Ms. Carter. People like that, they only act big when they think no one is watching. As soon as you shine a light on them, they turn into shadows." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She had passed him in the halls 100 times. She had seen him fixing the lights, checking the HVAC vents, carrying his tools through the lobby. To her, he had been part of the building's architecture, functional, necessary, but invisible. Now he was the most significant person in her world. She noticed the fine lines of fatigue around his eyes and the steady, capable way he moved. There was no ego in his stance, just a quiet, unshakable integrity. "You risked everything," she said softly. "They could have turned on you." Elias met her gaze. I've faced worse than those two in my time. A man who has to look his daughter in the eye every morning doesn't have much room for fear. In my world, you protect what's right, even if the person you're protecting doesn't know your name. His humility was as vast as the building he maintained, a silent foundation that held up the sky. How did you know exactly what to say? She asked, stepping out of the elevator with him. And is it true? About the audio recording? Ilias gave her a small, knowing smirk. The cameras are about 10 years old. They barely catch a clear image, let alone sound. And the blue light? That's just a power indicator I installed last week because the old ones kept burning out. Sarah gasped, a small laugh escaping her lips despite the trauma of the night. You lied? You took that risk for me? It wasn't a risk, Elias said firmly. It was a calculation. I knew they were cowards. Cowards always fear the light. I just gave them a reason to be afraid. He started walking toward the service entrance, his boots clicking rhythmically on the stone. Wait, Sarah called out. How long have you worked here? I've seen you, but I never realized. 3 years, he replied, stopping and turning back. I like the quiet of the night shift. It suits me. It gives me time to think. And more importantly, it gives me time to be the father Maya deserves. 3 years, Sarah repeated, her mind reeling. She thought of all the times she had been stressed about a meeting or a stock price, while this man was quietly ensuring the very air she breathed was conditioned and the floors she walked on were safe. I'm Sarah, Sarah Carter. I know who you are, Miss Carter, he said. I'm Elias. Elias, she said the name, anchoring it in her memory. Can I do something for you? A promotion? A different shift? Anything you need? Elias thought of Maya, sleeping soundly in her bed, dreaming of star-shaped pancakes. He thought of the simple, honest life they had built together. I'm good where I am, Sarah. I have everything I need. Just maybe tell the security team to actually check the feeds once in a while. It would make my job a lot easier. And perhaps remember that the most important parts of this building aren't the ones made of glass. He gave her a respectful nod and walked away, his heavy toolbox swinging at his side. Sarah watched him until he disappeared through the heavy metal doors of the maintenance wing. She stood in the empty lobby of her own empire, feeling smaller and more humbled than she ever had in her life. In the weeks that followed, something fundamental changed within Sarah Carter. The merger went through and her firm reached new heights of financial success, but she found that her definition of value had shifted. She no longer walked through the halls with her eyes fixed on her phone or her mind buried in a spreadsheet. She began to notice the people. She noticed the woman who cleaned the glass partitions at 6 a.m. She noticed the security guard who knew the names of everyone's children. And most of all, she noticed the maintenance crew. She made it a point to learn their names, to ask about their families, to acknowledge the invisible labor that kept her world spinning. She realized that leadership wasn't just about making the big decisions. It was about protecting the environment where everyone could feel safe and seen. Sarah also implemented a comprehensive overhaul of the building's security protocols. She didn't just fire the negligent staff. She invested in training and new technology, ensuring that no one, whether a CEO or a clerk, would ever feel trapped again. But she did it all quietly, without fanfare, following the example of the man who had saved her. She became a protector of the people who kept her empire upright. She spent her mornings ensuring that the benefits packages for the janitorial and maintenance staff were the best in the city. She often thought about Elias. She found out more about him, about his daughter, his late wife, and the incredible devotion he had to his family. She saw him occasionally, usually in the late evenings, when she was staying late to finish up her work. They didn't have long conversations, but there was a shared understanding between them, a quiet bond forged in those terrifying minutes between the 40th and 10th floors. One evening, about a month after the incident, Sarah was standing in the elevator, ready to head home. The doors were about to close when a familiar hand reached out and triggered the sensor. Elias stepped in, his toolbox in hand, his face etched with the familiar weariness of a man who worked hard for the people he loved. The elevator began to descend. This time the lights were bright, the cables were smooth, and the air was clear. Sarah looked at him and smiled. It wasn't the practiced, professional smile she gave to investors. It was a warm, genuine expression of respect. "Good evening, Elias," she said. Elias looked up, his eyes softening as he recognized her. He shifted his toolbox and gave a small, graceful nod. "Good evening, Miss Carter," he replied. "It's Sarah," she reminded him gently. "Good evening, Sarah," he said, the name sounding natural in his deep voice. As the elevator moved silently toward the ground, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. She realized that the most powerful man she had ever met didn't wear a suit, didn't have a corner office, and didn't care about the stock market. He was a father, a protector, and a man who understood that the true measure of a person isn't found in what they own, but in what they are willing to do when no one, or everyone, is watching. The doors opened into the lobby. They walked out together, two people from different worlds, connected by a moment of courage. Elias headed toward the maintenance office to start his night, and Sarah headed toward the exit, ready to go home. As she stepped out into the cool Boston air, she looked up at the towering skyscraper. It was a monument to wealth and power, but to her it was now something else. It was a place where heroes worked in the shadows, where single dads held the world together with a toolbox and a quiet word, and where, for one brief moment in a stuck elevator, everything had changed for the better. She walked toward her car, her heart light. She was still a CEO, still a leader, still a success. But now she was something more. She was a woman who knew the value of the light and the man who wasn't afraid to shine it. And in the quiet of the city night, that was the greatest success of all. The story of the elevator incident eventually became a quiet legend in the building. Not because Sarah told everyone, she kept the details private out of respect for Elias, but because the atmosphere of the tower itself had changed. There was more kindness in the hallways. There was more respect in the interactions. And every time the elevator doors closed, the people inside felt just a little bit safer, knowing that somewhere in the building, Elias Thorne was watching over the machinery, and his quiet strength was the most reliable part of the whole structure. Elias continued his shifts, making his star-shaped pancakes and listening to Maya's stories about school. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He just thought of himself as a dad who did what was necessary. And in the end, that was exactly what made him the most extraordinary man Sarah Carter had ever met. The lights of the Boston skyline twinkled, 1,000 tiny sparks of life and story. And in one of those towers, a maintenance man and a CEO shared a silent, mutual respect that proved that even in a world of steel and glass, the human heart remains the most powerful force of all. 8:17 p.m. The day begins for some and ends for others. But for Elias and Sarah, the time would always represent the moment they found something they had both been missing. A reminder that no one is truly invisible and that a single voice spoken with truth can change the world. The elevator continues to move up and down, floor after floor, carrying the stories of 1,000 lives. But that one descent, that one quiet conversation, would echo forever. Elias Thorne, the single dad with the toolbox. Sarah Carter, the CEO who learned to see. Together, they proved that sometimes the most important journey you ever take is only a few floors down. And when the doors open, you are never the same person you were when they closed. If you enjoyed this powerful story of courage and human connection, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to High TL Stories for more inspiring narratives every day. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.